What if I told you that a family of 4 vanished from a luxury cruise ship in the middle of the Caribbean, and 5 years later, a weathered suitcase washed ashore containing something that would change everything we thought we knew about their disappearance? What if I told you that this wasn't just a missing persons case, but evidence of the most sophisticated human experimentation program ever conducted in international waters? The Harper family case isn't just another missing persons story. It's a puzzle that involves international waters, security footage that doesn't add up, classified government research programs, and a discovery that left investigators questioning whether some mysteries are meant to stay buried. This case will challenge everything you believe about cruise ship safety, government oversight, and the lengths some organizations will go to conduct illegal research on human subjects. Stay with me until the end, because what was found in that suitcase will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about cruise ship safety. And trust me, you'll want to hear the theory that even the FBI couldn't dismiss. A theory that suggests the Harper family stumbled onto something so dangerous that it cost them their lives. I've been investigating cold cases for over 22 years, and the Harper family disappearance still keeps me awake at night. It was March 15th, 2018, when I first heard about this case, and from that moment I knew this wasn't going to be like anything I'd encountered before. A family of 4 had simply vanished from the Oceanic Voyager, a massive cruise ship carrying over 4,000 passengers and 500 crew members. But this wasn't your typical overboard scenario. This wasn't a suicide or an accident. This was something else entirely, something that would eventually lead me down a rabbit hole of government conspiracies, illegal human experimentation, and cover-ups that reach the highest levels of power. Let me tell you about the Harpers, because they were exactly the kind of family that makes cases like this so heartbreaking. David Harper, 42, was a successful software engineer from Portland, Oregon. He worked for Intel, specializing in processor architecture and security protocols. His colleagues described him as meticulous, cautious, and incredibly intelligent, not the type of person to take unnecessary risks or make impulsive decisions. Sarah Harper, 38, worked as a high school guidance counselor at Lincoln High School in Portland. She was beloved by her students and colleagues, known for her empathy and her ability to help troubled teenagers navigate their problems. Their 2 children, Emma, 16, and Jake, 12, were honor students with bright futures ahead of them. Emma was planning to study marine biology in college, inspired by her love of ocean documentaries. Jake was a math prodigy who could solve complex equations in his head and dreamed of becoming an aerospace engineer. The Harper family had been saving for 3 years to afford this Caribbean cruise. David had been working overtime for months, taking on extra consulting projects to boost their vacation fund. Sarah had been tutoring students after school and working summer programs to contribute to their savings. The kids had been doing chores and small jobs around the neighborhood, adding their earnings to the family vacation jar that sat on their kitchen counter. This wasn't just a vacation for them. It was a dream they had worked toward together, a reward for years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. When they finally booked their cruise on the Oceanic Voyager, they spent weeks researching activities and planning their itinerary. Emma had made a list of all the marine life she hoped to see during their snorkeling excursions. Jake had studied the ship's layout and memorized the locations of the arcade, the ice cream stand, and the observatory deck where he planned to stargaze. David had downloaded apps to help him identify Caribbean birds and fish. Sarah had purchased underwater cameras so they could document their adventures. Everything about their preparation suggested a family that was excited, organized, and completely unaware of the danger they were walking into. The Oceanic Voyager was scheduled for a 7-day cruise from Miami to various Caribbean islands, including stops in Cozumel, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. The ship itself was impressive. A floating city equipped with restaurants, pools, theaters, shopping areas, rock climbing walls, and even a surf simulator. The vessel was 1,112 feet long, 154 feet wide, and could accommodate up to 4,200 passengers across 15 passenger decks. The ship's security system was supposedly state-of-the-art, with over 3,000 cameras covering virtually every public area. Every passenger wore an electronic bracelet that tracked their movements throughout the ship, and every cabin door required a key card that logged entry and exit times. It seemed impossible for anyone to simply disappear without a trace. But what passengers didn't know was that the Oceanic Voyager had a history that the cruise line worked very hard to keep secret. The ship had originally been built in 1987 as the USNS Meridian, a research vessel for the United States Navy. For 16 years, it had served as a platform for classified experiments in psychological warfare, behavioral modification, and what military documents euphemistically called enhanced interrogation techniques. The ship had been decommissioned in 2003 and sold to private investors who converted it into a cruise liner, but many of its original research facilities remained hidden within the ship's structure. The conversion process had been overseen by a company called Maritime Renovations, Inc., to which was actually a front for a consortium of defense contractors and private research organizations. Instead of removing the ship's experimental facilities, they had simply concealed them behind false walls and reclassified them as maintenance areas and crew quarters. The result was a cruise ship with a dark secret, hidden laboratories, observation rooms, and detention facilities that could be activated whenever the ship's true owners needed to conduct covert research. The Harper family boarded the ship on a sunny Saturday morning in March 2018, completely unaware of the vessel's sinister history. Security footage shows them walking up the gangway, laughing and taking pictures. David carried a large duffel bag containing their snorkeling gear and cameras. Sarah pulled their bright red Samsonite suitcase, the same one that would wash ashore 5 years later with evidence that would blow this case wide open. Emma bounced excitedly as she took selfies with her phone, and Jake was practically vibrating with anticipation as he pointed out various features of the ship to his parents. They checked into their interior cabin on Deck 7, room 7432. The cabin was small but comfortable, with 2 twin beds, a small bathroom, and a tiny closet. What they didn't know was that their room assignment hadn't been random. According to internal documents I would later obtain, the Harper family had been specifically selected for placement in cabin 7432 based on psychological profiles compiled from their social media activity, credit card purchases, and other digital footprints. They fit the exact parameters that the ship's covert research program was looking for: a stable, close-knit family unit with no history of mental illness, no suspicious behavior patterns, and no connections to law enforcement or intelligence agencies. The cabin itself had been specially modified in the weeks before their cruise. Hidden cameras had been installed behind the mirrors and inside the television. Sensors capable of monitoring heart rate, brain activity, and stress hormones had been built into the beds and chairs. The air conditioning system had been modified to allow for the introduction of subliminal audio messages and trace amounts of psychoactive compounds. Even the bathroom fixtures contained monitoring equipment that could analyze their urine and saliva for biological markers of psychological stress. The first 2 days of the cruise went exactly as the Harper family had hoped. Fellow passengers later recalled seeing them at the buffet, by the pool, and attending the ship's evening entertainment. Emma had quickly made friends with a group of teenagers from Texas, and they spent their time exploring the ship and participating in teen activities. Jake was obsessed with the arcade, where he had already achieved high scores on several games and earned enough tickets to redeem for a small stuffed dolphin. David and Sarah seemed more relaxed than they'd been in years, holding hands as they walked the deck and actually smiling in their vacation photos. They participated in trivia night on their second evening, finishing third out of 22 teams with their combined knowledge of 80s music, geography, and pop culture. They took photos at the captain's dinner, where they were seated at a table with two other families and spent the evening swapping stories about their kids and their hometowns. They even won a small prize in the ship's daily raffle, a bottle of champagne that they planned to save for their last night aboard. Every piece of evidence suggested they were having the time of their lives, completely unaware that they were being monitored and studied by researchers who viewed them not as guests, but as test subjects. But on the third night, something changed. The ship's security logs show the Harper family returning to their cabin at approximately 10:47 p.m. after watching a magic show in the main theater. The electronic bracelet data confirms all four family members entered room 7432 that night. But here's where the official story starts to fall apart. According to the ship's tracking system, they never left their cabin again. The electronic bracelets registered no movement. The door logs showed no exits, and the corridor cameras captured no footage of them leaving their room. Yet when housekeeping knocked on their door the next morning at 9:15 a.m., the cabin was empty. I've spent countless hours studying the crime scene photos from that cabin, and every detail tells a story of a family that was expecting to return. The beds were unmade, but not in a way that suggested a struggle. More like people who had simply gotten up in the middle of the night and stepped out briefly. David's reading glasses were folded neatly on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. The pen was still uncapped, lying across the puzzle as if he had just set it down. Sarah's phone was plugged into the charger by her bed, showing 73% battery life. The phone's call log showed that she had tried to contact her sister in Portland at 11:23 p.m., but the call had failed due to poor cellular reception at sea. Emma's makeup was scattered across the small vanity, but not carelessly. It was arranged as if she had been in the middle of her nighttime routine and had been interrupted. Her moisturizer was uncapped, her toothbrush was still damp, and her retainer was soaking in its cleaning solution. Jake's Nintendo DS was on his bed, with a Pokemon game still paused mid-battle. His character was in the middle of a gym battle that he had been working toward for days, and everyone who knew Jake understood that he would never have abandoned that achievement willingly. Their clothes were hanging in the tiny closet exactly as they had arranged them. Sarah had organized everything by person and by day, with each family member's outfits for the remaining cruise days hanging in order. Their passports were locked in the room's safe, along with Sarah's jewelry and the cash they had brought for tips and souvenirs. Their shoes were lined up by the door in the obsessively neat way that David always arranged them. Even their dirty laundry was folded in the small hamper, separated into lights and darks, just as Sarah did at home. What made this scene even more unsettling was what wasn't there. Despite the appearance that the family had simply stepped out temporarily, several items were missing. David's small backpack, which he had carried their cameras and water bottles in during the day, was gone. Sarah's purse, which contained their room key, her identification, and emergency medications for Jake's asthma, was nowhere to be found. Most significantly, the red Samsonite suitcase that Sarah had pulled up the gangway on their first day was missing from the cabin. The ship's security system presented an even more confusing picture. Every corridor, elevator, stairwell, and public area was monitored by high-definition cameras that recorded continuously to secure servers. The ship's head of security, Captain Antonio Martinez, had assured investigators that it was impossible for anyone to move around the ship without being recorded somewhere. The cameras had motion detection software that could track individuals even in crowded areas, and the system had backup power supplies that kept it running even during maintenance periods. Yet despite this comprehensive surveillance network, there was no footage of the Harper family leaving their cabin after 10:47 p.m. on Tuesday night. The corridor camera directly outside their room showed the hallway remaining empty throughout the night, with only two other passengers visible. An elderly man who left his cabin at 11:15 p.m. to get ice and returned 5 minutes later, and a young woman who passed through the corridor at 2:30 a.m., returning from what appeared to be a late-night visit to another cabin. The electronic bracelet system provided equally puzzling data. Each passenger's bracelet contained an RFID chip that communicated with sensors throughout the ship, logging their location every few minutes. The system was designed to help with emergency evacuations and to prevent unauthorized access to restricted areas. According to the logs, all 4 Harper family bracelets remained in cabin 7432 from 10:47 p.m. until the following morning. But when security personnel searched the cabin, the bracelets were nowhere to be found. Captain Martinez, a veteran of 23 years in cruise ship security, told investigators that he had never seen anything like it. "In my experience, when passengers go overboard, we find evidence," he explained. "Broken railings, disturbed deck furniture, witnesses who heard screams or splashes. When passengers have medical emergencies, we find them in corridors or public areas. When passengers are involved in crimes, we have footage, witnesses, physical evidence. But this was like they just ceased to exist." The ship's crew conducted an immediate and thorough search. Every public area was scoured, every deck was examined, and every passenger was questioned. The Oceanic Voyager was still 2 days away from its next port, somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, between the Yucatan Peninsula and Jamaica. The captain made the difficult decision to turn the ship around and contact the Coast Guard, while beginning an emergency search protocol that involved checking every room, storage area, and mechanical space on the vessel. "I've spoken with dozens of passengers who were on that cruise, and they all described the same eerie atmosphere that settled over the ship once the Harper family was discovered missing." The initial announcements asking the Harper family to report to guest services were routine, almost cheerful. But as the hours passed and the family remained missing, the tone of the announcements became increasingly urgent and worried. Crew members went door to door, checking every cabin and asking passengers if they had seen the missing family. Some passengers were asked to participate in organized search groups that combed the ship's public areas. Margaret Westbrook, a retired teacher from Ohio who'd been staying in the cabin next to the Harpers, told me about the sounds she heard that night. "I'm a light sleeper, and I'm used to hearing people in the hallways. Doors closing, conversations, footsteps," she said during our phone interview. "But around midnight, I heard something different from the Harper cabin. It sounded like furniture being moved, but very quietly, like someone was trying to be careful not to make noise. Then I heard what sounded like whispered voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying." Margaret had assumed that the family was simply reorganizing their cabin, or perhaps dealing with a child who couldn't sleep. She hadn't thought much of it until the next morning, when the announcement was made that the family was missing. "When I told the security officers about the sounds, they seemed very interested," she recalled. "They asked me to describe exactly what I had heard and what time it had occurred. But when I tried to follow up with them later, they told me that my statement had been noted, but that they couldn't share any information about the investigation." Other passengers reported strange occurrences throughout the ship that night. Thomas Chen, a businessman from San Francisco, told investigators that he had seen someone in maintenance coveralls moving equipment through the corridors around 1 a.m. "I was coming back from the casino, and I saw 2 people in dark coveralls wheeling what looked like a large laundry cart," he explained. "I didn't think much of it at the time, because maintenance work on ships often happens at night to avoid disturbing passengers, but looking back, it seemed unusual because they were wearing face masks, which wasn't common in 2018. The Coast Guard response was swift and comprehensive. Within 6 hours of the ship's distress call, helicopters were circling the waters and search boats were combing the area where the Oceanic Voyager had traveled during the night. The search zone covered over 200 square miles of ocean, taking into account current patterns, wind direction, and the possibility that the family had gone overboard at any point during the night. Coast Guard, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who coordinated the search operation, later told me that it was one of the most extensive searches she had ever overseen. We deployed 2 helicopters, 3 cutters, and a C-130 aircraft, she explained. We had optimal weather conditions, clear skies, calm seas, excellent visibility. If there had been any trace of those people in the water, we would have found it. We searched for 6 days, covering an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. We found nothing. No bodies, no debris, no personal items, nothing. The search operation was complicated by the fact that the ship had continued moving for several hours after the family was last seen. By the time the Coast Guard was notified, the potential search area had expanded significantly. However, the search teams were thorough and systematic, using advanced sonar equipment to scan the ocean floor and thermal imaging technology to detect any heat signatures in the water. During the search, the Coast Guard also conducted a detailed inspection of the Oceanic Voyager itself. Teams of investigators went through every inch of the ship, looking for any clue about what might have happened to the Harper family. They interviewed every crew member and many of the passengers, collected hours of security footage, and even brought in cadaver dogs to search for any trace of human remains. The FBI boarded the ship when it returned to Miami 3 days early, cutting short what should have been a joyous vacation for over 4,000 people. The federal agents were led by Special Agent Rebecca Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau's Violent Crimes Division who had worked on dozens of missing persons cases. Agent Walsh later told me that the Harper case was unlike anything she had encountered in her career. Most missing persons cases have some kind of explanation, even if it's not immediately obvious, Agent Walsh explained during our meeting at the FBI field office in Miami. People don't just vanish into thin air, especially not entire families. There are always clues: financial problems, relationship issues, mental health concerns, criminal connections, but the Harpers had none of these risk factors. They were financially stable, happily married, mentally healthy, and had no enemies or legal problems. The FBI's investigation was methodical and thorough. They conducted over 300 interviews with passengers and crew members. They analyzed thousands of hours of security footage from throughout the ship. They examined the Harper family's financial records, social media accounts, and communications to look for any indication that they might have planned their own disappearance. They coordinated with Interpol to check for any signs that the family might have somehow left the ship at a foreign port and assumed new identities. Every investigative avenue led to the same conclusion. The Harper family had simply vanished without a trace. Their bank accounts showed no suspicious activity. Their credit cards hadn't been used since their last purchase in the ship's gift shop on Tuesday afternoon. Their cell phones last pinged cell towers in international waters, and there was no evidence that they had contacted anyone after Tuesday evening. Their social media accounts went silent, their emails went unanswered, and their extended family and friends had no knowledge of any plans that might explain their disappearance. The investigation revealed several concerning details about the ship's operations that night. The ship's waste management system had been running unusually high cycles between midnight and 4 a.m., processing significantly more waste than normal for that time period. The ship's laundry facilities had also been operating at capacity throughout the night, despite the fact that most laundry services were typically shut down after midnight. Several crew members reported seeing maintenance personnel in areas where no scheduled maintenance was supposed to be taking place. Most disturbing of all, the ship's security footage showed several gaps and anomalies. While the corridor outside the Harper cabin appeared to be continuously monitored, careful analysis revealed that there were brief periods, never more than 30 seconds, where the timestamp jumped forward without any corresponding footage. These gaps occurred at 12:17 a.m., 1:43 a.m., and 3:22 a.m., suggesting that someone with access to the security system had deliberately edited the recordings. The ship's crew was extensively vetted during the investigation. Most were standard cruise employees, housekeeping staff from the Philippines, waiters from Eastern Europe, entertainment crew from various countries. Their backgrounds checked out, their immigration status was legal, and their employment histories were legitimate. However, there were 12 crew members whose backgrounds the FBI couldn't fully verify. Some had social security numbers that had been issued to deceased individuals. Others had passports from countries that claimed no record of their citizenship. One of these crew members was particularly suspicious. A man named Viktor Petrov, who worked in the ship's maintenance department. Petrov claimed to be a Russian immigrant who had been working on cruise ships for over a decade, but when investigators tried to verify his background, they discovered that his employment history contained significant gaps and inconsistencies. His previous employers either couldn't be contacted or claimed no record of his employment. His immigration paperwork appeared to be legitimate, but contained subtle errors that suggested it might be forged. When investigators tried to interview Petrov 3 days after the Harper family's disappearance, they discovered that he had left the ship during the emergency return to Miami and had not reported for his next scheduled shift. His listed address in Miami turned out to be a vacant lot, and his emergency contact information led to disconnected phone numbers. It was as if Viktor Petrov had simply ceased to exist, just like the Harper family. The case quickly gained national attention, with major news networks covering the story and online forums buzzing with theories. CNN ran a week-long series on cruise ship safety, questioning whether the industry's self-regulation was adequate to protect passengers. Fox News focused on the possibility of terrorism or human trafficking, interviewing experts who suggested that the family might have been kidnapped for political or financial reasons. Social media was filled with speculation ranging from reasonable theories about accidental drowning to wild conspiracies involving alien abduction or government cover-ups. Some amateur investigators suggested that the family had planned their own disappearance, perhaps to escape financial problems or legal troubles. However, this theory was quickly debunked by the FBI's financial investigation, which showed that the Harpers were financially stable and had no legal issues. Others proposed that they had been victims of a crime committed by other passengers or crew members, but the lack of any evidence of violence or struggle made this scenario unlikely. A few online theorists focused on the technical aspects of the case, questioning how the family could have bypassed the ship's security systems. Some suggested that they had received help from crew members, while others proposed that the security system itself had been compromised. These theories gained credibility when news broke about the suspicious crew member Viktor Petrov and the anomalies in the security footage. As weeks turned into months, the investigation hit dead end after dead end. The ship's crew was thoroughly vetted, and no evidence of foul play was found among the legitimate employees. The electronic bracelet system was examined by multiple experts, all confirming that it was functioning properly and couldn't be easily tampered with. The security cameras were analyzed frame by specialized technicians. But aside from the brief timestamp anomalies, no evidence of tampering was discovered. The Harper family's disappearance became one of those cases that law enforcement agencies hate, a mystery with no logical explanation. The FBI officially classified it as a missing persons case, but privately, investigators were baffled. I became involved in the case at this point when Agent Walsh contacted me through a mutual colleague who knew about my work on cold cases. She was hoping that a fresh perspective might reveal something that the official investigation had missed. I spent my first month on the case studying everything the FBI had collected. I read every interview transcript, examined every piece of evidence, and studied the ship's layout and operational procedures. What struck me immediately was how clean the crime scene was, almost too clean. In my experience, when families disappear or are abducted, There are always signs of haste, confusion, or struggle. But the Harper cabin looked like they had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. This led me to investigate the possibility that the family hadn't been taken from their cabin at all, but had left voluntarily under some kind of duress. Perhaps they had been contacted by someone claiming to be ship security, or told that there was an emergency requiring them to evacuate their cabin. This would explain why they had taken certain items with them and why there were no signs of a struggle. I began mapping out the ship's layout, paying special attention to areas that weren't covered by security cameras. Despite the cruise line's claims that the ship was comprehensively monitored, I discovered that there were several corridors and service areas where camera coverage was limited or non-existent. These areas were primarily used by crew members for maintenance and supply operations, but they could potentially provide routes for moving people without being detected. My investigation into the ship's history revealed some disturbing information. The Oceanic Voyager wasn't just any cruise ship. It was a converted military vessel that had originally been built for classified government research. The conversion to a passenger cruise liner had taken place in 2003, but when I requested the ship's complete architectural plans through a Freedom of Information Act request, entire sections were redacted for national security reasons. This discovery led me to investigate the ship's ownership structure, which turned out to be incredibly complex. Oceanic Cruise Lines was technically owned by a Bermuda-registered corporation called Neptune Holdings, which was owned by a Cayman Islands trust called Poseidon Investment Group, which was managed by a Swiss bank that refused to disclose its clients' identities. The web of shell companies and offshore holdings made it nearly impossible to identify who actually controlled the ship. However, I did find one connection that made my blood run cold. Among the ship's corporate documentation, buried in hundreds of pages of legal filings, I discovered that one of the minority shareholders in the ownership structure was a company called Nexus Behavioral Research. A quick investigation revealed that Nexus had been involved in several controversial psychological studies in the 1990s, including experiments that had been shut down by the FDA for violating ethical guidelines on human subjects research. Nexus Behavioral Research had been founded in 1987 by Dr. Marcus Steinberg, a former CIA psychologist who had worked on the infamous MKUltra mind control experiments in the 1960s and 70s. After MKUltra was officially shut down, Steinberg had gone into private practice, establishing Nexus as a research organization that claimed to study human behavioral optimization for corporate and government clients. Throughout the 1990s, Nexus had conducted studies that pushed the boundaries of ethical research. They had experimented with sensory deprivation, subliminal messaging, pharmaceutical manipulation of mood and behavior, and what they called environmental psychology, studying how changes in a person's surroundings could influence their thoughts and actions. Most of these studies had been conducted on volunteers who weren't fully informed about the nature of the experiments they were participating in. The FDA had shut down Nexus's domestic operations in 1998 after a whistleblower revealed that the organization had been conducting unauthorized drug trials on psychiatric patients. However, instead of dissolving, Nexus had simply moved its operations offshore, beyond the reach of American regulatory agencies. They had established research facilities in countries with lax oversight and had begun conducting studies that would have been illegal in the United States. Dr. Amanda Sterling, a former researcher at Nexus, who had blown the whistle on the company's unethical practices, agreed to meet with me at a secure location in Washington, D.C. Dr. Sterling had been living under an assumed name for over a decade, constantly worried about retaliation from her former employers. She was thin and nervous, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning for threats. Nexus never stopped their research. Dr. T. Sterling told me during our 3-hour conversation in a small coffee shop near Georgetown University. They just moved it offshore, away from FDA oversight and American laws. Dr. Steinberg was obsessed with developing new methods of behavioral control and psychological manipulation. He believed that traditional therapy and medication were primitive compared to what could be achieved through environmental manipulation and subliminal conditioning. Dr. Sterling explained that Nexus had been particularly interested in studying family dynamics under stress. Steinberg's theory was that by subjecting family units to specific psychological pressures, researchers could identify the breaking points that would cause family bonds to dissolve, she said. He believed that understanding these breaking points could be used to develop more effective interrogation techniques, or conversely, to strengthen family bonds in military and corporate settings. The conversation with Dr. Sterling opened up an entirely new line of investigation. If Nexus behavioral research had some connection to the oceanic voyager, it was possible that the Harper family had been selected not as random victims of a crime, but as test subjects for some kind of psychological experiment. This would explain the careful selection of their cabin, the sophisticated monitoring equipment that would have been necessary to track their movements and behavior, and the clean disappearance that left no trace of violence. Dr. Sterling provided me with the names of other former Nexus researchers who might be willing to talk, as well as details about the company's research methods and facilities. She also warned me that investigating Nexus could be dangerous. They have connections throughout the intelligence community, she said. People who ask too many questions about their work have a tendency to have accidents or to simply disappear. You need to be very careful about who you trust and how you proceed with this investigation. Armed with this new information, I began investigating whether there were any connections between Nexus behavioral research and the specific details of the Harper family's disappearance. I started by looking into the backgrounds of the cruise passengers and crew members, searching for anyone who might have had connections to psychological research or government intelligence work. This investigation led me to Margaret Crenshaw, a former cruise ship inspector who had worked for the Maritime Safety Authority until her retirement in 2016. Margaret agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Fort Lauderdale, but only after I assured her that our conversation would be off the record and that I would not use any recording devices. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see through everything. When I mentioned the oceanic voyager, her expression darkened immediately. "That ship should have been decommissioned years ago," Margaret told me, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced around the coffee shop to make sure we weren't being overheard. I filed report after report about irregularities in its structure, but they were always buried by higher-ups in the agency. There are sections of that ship that don't appear on any passenger-accessible deck plans. Rooms that are sealed off and marked as storage, but when you put your ear to the walls, you can hear machinery running. Machinery that wasn't supposed to be there. Margaret explained that during her inspections of the oceanic voyager between 2010 and 2015, she had discovered discrepancies between the ship's official capacity and its actual layout. According to the documentation provided by the cruise line, the ship could accommodate 4,200 passengers and 1,500 crew members across 15 passenger decks. But Margaret's measurements suggested there was space for significantly more people, and that several areas marked as storage or mechanical on the ship's plans were actually configured as living quarters. "It was like they had built a ship within a ship," Margaret said, stirring her coffee nervously. "Hidden decks, secret corridors, rooms that you could only access through maintenance areas. When I tried to explore these spaces during my inspection, I was told they were off-limits due to ongoing renovations that had been going on for years. I was shown documentation indicating that these areas contained sensitive equipment related to the ship's navigation and communication systems. Margaret's revelations suggested that the Oceanic Voyager was not simply a converted military vessel, but a ship that had been specifically designed to conduct covert operations while maintaining the facade of a civilian cruise liner. The hidden areas she had discovered could have housed research laboratories, detention facilities, or observation rooms where passengers could be monitored without their knowledge. This theory gained credibility when I investigated the ship's modification history and discovered that much of the conversion work had been performed by contractors with connections to the defense and intelligence communities. The company that had overseen the conversion, Maritime Renovations Inc., was actually a subsidiary of a larger defense contractor that specialized in building facilities for classified government operations. The conversation with Margaret also led me to investigate the ship's medical facilities, which she had described as being unusually extensive for a cruise liner. The ship's infirmary was larger than most hospital emergency rooms, with equipment and capabilities that went far beyond what would be needed to treat typical cruise-related injuries and illnesses. There were also pharmaceutical storage areas that contained drugs not typically found on civilian vessels, medications used in psychiatric treatment, and experimental compounds that weren't available to the general public. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had served as the ship's physician during the cruise when the Harpers disappeared, initially declined to speak with me about the case. However, after several months of gentle persistence and assurances about confidentiality, she agreed to a phone conversation. Dr. Rodriguez had left cruise ship work entirely after the Harper incident and was now practicing family medicine in Tampa, Florida. "I've worked on cruise ships for 12 years, Dr. Rodriguez told me during our hour-long phone conversation. "I've seen everything from heart attacks to food poisoning to psychiatric emergencies. I've treated passengers who fell downstairs, who had allergic reactions to food, who suffered from seasickness so severe they became dehydrated. But that cruise was different from anything I had experienced before." Dr. Rodriguez explained that starting from the second night of the cruise, passengers had begun coming to the infirmary with complaints she had never heard before in her years of maritime medicine. They described feeling like they were being watched in their cabins, even when they were alone, she said. Some reported that their mirrors seemed to show reflections that didn't match their movements. Others complained of hearing voices or music that seemed to be coming from inside the walls of their cabins. Initially, Dr. Rodriguez had attributed these symptoms to anxiety, seasickness, or the disorientation that some passengers experience when adapting to life on a ship. However, as the reports continued and became more specific and consistent, she began to suspect that something more serious was happening. When multiple passengers report the same unusual symptoms, it's usually an indication of environmental factors. Contaminated food, toxic fumes, something in the water supply, she explained. But these symptoms didn't fit any pattern I recognized from my medical training. The doctor had documented over 24 cases of passengers reporting strange experiences with the mirrors in their cabins during the cruise. At first, I thought it might be mass hysteria or some kind of psychological contagion, she said. But then I experienced it myself. I was in my quarters one night, brushing my teeth, when I noticed that my reflection in the mirror was moving slightly out of sync with my actual movements. It was subtle, like a half-second delay, but it was definitely there. Dr. Rodriguez had reported these incidents to the ship's administration, requesting that maintenance personnel examine the mirror installations and the cabin environments for any technical problems that might be causing these perceptual disturbances. However, her requests had been denied, and she had been told that discussing these incidents with passengers or other crew members could cause panic and was therefore prohibited. The response from the administration was very strange, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Usually, when passengers report medical symptoms that might be related to the ship's environment, there's an immediate investigation. The safety of passengers is supposed to be the top priority. But in this case, I was told that my concerns had been noted and that appropriate specialists would handle the situation. I was instructed to treat the symptoms rather than investigate the causes. No, but it wasn't just the mirror incidents that troubled Dr. Rodriguez. She had also noticed that the ship's internal environmental systems were behaving unusually throughout the voyage. The climate control system showed that all areas of the ship were maintaining their preset temperatures, she explained, but passengers and crew members were reporting extreme temperature fluctuations in certain areas. Some cabins would become unbearably hot without warning, while others would drop to near freezing temperatures even when the thermostat was set to 75 degrees. These temperature anomalies seemed to follow a pattern that Dr. Rodriguez had mapped during the cruise. The affected areas were all located on decks 6, 7, and 8, the same section where the Harper family's cabin was located. The incidents formed a cluster around rooms 7430 through 7435, with cabin 7432, the Harper family's room, right in the center of this unusual zone. I had never seen anything like it in my years of cruise ship medicine, Dr. Rodriguez said. It was as if someone was conducting experiments on the passengers in that section of the ship, testing their responses to environmental manipulations. But that seemed impossible. Cruise ships are heavily regulated, and there are strict protocols for passenger safety and medical care. However, Dr. Rodriguez's concerns had been dismissed by the ship's senior staff when she had requested permission to relocate passengers from the affected cabins. She had been told that all cabins were fully booked and that moving passengers would cause unnecessary alarm. When she had suggested that the ship's environmental systems needed immediate inspection, she had been informed that maintenance schedules were set months in advance and couldn't be changed without approval from the corporate office. The final disturbing detail that Dr. Rodriguez shared with me concerned the Harper family specifically. I had examined Jake Harper on the first day of the cruise, she said. He had a mild case of motion sickness, which is very common, especially in children. I prescribed some medication and gave his parents instructions for helping him adjust to the ship's movement. But when I reviewed my records after the family disappeared, I noticed something strange. According to Dr. Rodriguez's medical logs, Jake Harper had been brought to the infirmary twice more during the cruise, once on Monday night and once on Tuesday afternoon, just hours before the family's disappearance. However, Dr. Rodriguez had no memory of these visits, and there were no treatment notes or prescription records associated with them. The log entries were minimal, containing only the dates, times, and Jake's name, with no indication of what symptoms he might have presented or what treatment he might have received. This was very unusual, Dr. Rodriguez explained. I keep detailed records of every patient interaction, and I have a good memory for faces and medical histories. I would definitely remember treating the same child 3 times in 5 days, but I have no recollection of those additional visits, and there's no documentation of what happened during them. When Dr. Rodriguez had questioned the ship's medical administrators about these mysterious log entries, she had been told that the records were accurate and that her memory was probably affected by the stress of the ship's emergency situation. However, she remained convinced that someone had been treating Jake Harper without her knowledge, possibly using her access credentials to make it appear that she had been responsible for the medical care. This revelation added another disturbing dimension to the Harper family's disappearance. If Jake had indeed been receiving unauthorized medical treatment, it suggested that the family had been specifically targeted for some kind of intervention. The timing of the alleged medical visits, culminating just hours before their disappearance, seemed too coincidental to be random. My investigation into the ship's medical records revealed additional anomalies. During the cruise, when the Harpers disappeared, the ship's pharmacy had dispensed unusually large quantities of certain medications, primarily sedatives, anti-anxiety drugs, and compounds used in psychological treatment. The prescriptions had been written by various doctors, but when I tried to verify their credentials, I discovered that several of the prescribing physicians didn't exist in any medical licensing databases. The ship's computerized medical system had also logged numerous patient interactions that the medical staff couldn't account for. Blood tests had been ordered and processed for passengers who had never visited the infirmary. Prescription medications had been dispensed to cabin numbers that didn't exist. Equipment had been checked out and returned by medical personnel who weren't on the ship's crew roster. These discoveries suggested that there had been a parallel medical operation running aboard the Oceanic Voyager, separate from the legitimate medical services provided to passengers. This shadow medical system appeared to have been monitoring and potentially treating passengers without their knowledge or consent, using sophisticated methods to avoid detection by the ship's regular medical staff. The evidence was beginning to paint a picture of a cruise ship that was not what it appeared to be. The Oceanic Voyager seemed to be a floating laboratory where passengers were unknowingly subjected to psychological and medical experiments. The Harper family had somehow discovered this truth, and their discovery had cost them their lives. But I needed more concrete evidence to prove this theory. The testimonies from Dr. Rodriguez and Margaret Crenshaw were compelling, but they wouldn't be enough to convince law enforcement or the media that a major cruise line was involved in illegal human experimentation. I needed to find physical evidence, documentation, or witnesses who could provide irrefutable proof of what was happening aboard the ship. My search for additional evidence led me to track down other former employees of the Oceanic Voyager who might have witnessed suspicious activities. Through maritime employment databases and social media searches, I was able to identify dozens of people who had worked on the ship during the years leading up to the Harper family's disappearance. Most of these former employees were reluctant to speak with me. Many had signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their employment termination, and they were afraid of legal repercussions if they violated these agreements. Others seemed genuinely frightened, expressing concerns about their safety if they revealed information about their experiences on the ship. However, I eventually found two former crew members who were willing to talk: Maria Santos, a former housekeeping supervisor from the Philippines, and James Mitchell, an American maintenance worker who had been employed on the ship for 3 years before quitting abruptly in late 2017. Maria Santos agreed to meet me at a restaurant in Queens, New York, where she now worked as a nanny for a wealthy family. She was nervous throughout our conversation, frequently glancing around the restaurant and speaking in hushed tones. Maria had worked on the Oceanic Voyager for 5 years, from 2013 to 2018, and had been responsible for supervising the housekeeping staff on decks 6, 7, and 8. There were areas of those decks that we were told never to clean, Maria told me in accented English, rooms that were marked as storage or maintenance, but sometimes we could hear people inside them. Voices, sometimes crying, sometimes screaming. When we asked our supervisors about it, they told us it was just the ship's sound system, or maybe passengers in nearby cabins. Maria explained that the housekeeping staff had occasionally been given special instructions for certain cabins, particularly in the 7430-7435 range where the Harper family had been staying. Sometimes we would be told to replace all the towels and bedding in a cabin, even if the passengers had only been there for 1 night, she said. Other times, we were instructed to leave cleaning supplies, special chemicals that we didn't normally use, in specific cabins. We were told these were for passengers with allergies or medical conditions. But the most disturbing part of Maria's testimony concerned the night that the Harper family disappeared. She'd been working the late shift that night, cleaning public areas and restocking supply closets, when she had observed unusual activity in the corridor outside the Harper family's cabin. Around midnight, I saw people in dark uniforms moving equipment through the hallway, Maria said. They had carts with medical equipment, machines with monitors and wires. I thought maybe someone in one of the cabins was having a medical emergency, but they were being very quiet, like they didn't want anyone to know what they were doing. Maria had watched from a supply closet as the uniformed personnel had used a master key to enter cabin 7432. She couldn't see exactly what they were doing inside the cabin, but she could hear muffled voices and the sound of equipment being moved around. After about 30 minutes, the personnel had emerged with their equipment carts and had wheeled them toward the service elevators that led to the ship's lower decks. "I never saw the Harper family come out of their cabin," Maria said, "but about an hour later, I saw the same people in uniforms wheeling different carts through the hallway. These carts were covered with sheets, and they were heavier. You could tell because the people pushing them were working harder. They took these carts to the same service elevators." Maria's description of the covered carts sent chills down my spine. The size and weight she described were consistent with carts that might have been used to transport unconscious or deceased people. If her observations were accurate, it suggested that the Harper family had been removed from their cabin while unconscious and taken to another part of the ship. When I asked Maria why she hadn't reported these observations to the ship's security or to the investigators who had questioned the crew, she became visibly frightened. The next morning, when they announced that the Harper family was missing, "I thought about telling someone what I had seen," she said. "But then my supervisor took me aside and told me that if I said anything about that night, I would lose my job and be deported back to the Philippines." She said that what I thought I had seen was probably just a medical emergency for another passenger, and that talking about it would cause problems for everyone. Maria had been so intimidated by this threat that she had remained silent during the official investigation. She had left her job on the ship shortly after the Harper incident and had never spoken about what she had witnessed until our conversation. James Mitchell, the former maintenance worker, provided an even more detailed account of the ship's hidden infrastructure. We met at a truck stop outside of Atlanta, where James now worked as a long-haul driver. He was a big man with calloused hands and a direct manner of speaking. Unlike Maria, he didn't seem frightened, he seemed angry. "I worked on ships for 15 years before I got on the Oceanic Voyager," James told me over coffee and pie. "I've seen every kind of ship design, every type of mechanical system. But that ship was different. There were areas that didn't make sense, rooms that weren't supposed to exist, equipment that didn't belong on a passenger vessel." James explained that as a maintenance worker, he had access to areas of the ship that were off-limits to passengers and most crew members. During his 3 years on the Oceanic Voyager, he had gradually mapped out the ship's true layout, including the hidden sections that didn't appear on any official plans. On decks 4 and 5, there were entire corridors that were sealed off and marked as condemned or under renovation, James said. But when you listened at the walls, you could hear machinery running, air circulation systems, electrical equipment, sometimes even voices. I managed to get into one of these areas once, and what I saw made my blood run cold. According to James, the hidden areas contained sophisticated medical and research equipment, including operating rooms, laboratories, and what appeared to be detention cells. "It was like a floating hospital, but not the kind where they help people," he said. "There were rooms with restraint devices, observation chambers with one-way glass, and equipment for monitoring vital signs and brain activity." James had also discovered that many of the ship's passenger cabins were equipped with hidden monitoring devices. The mirrors in certain cabins weren't just mirrors, they were two-way glass with cameras and sensors behind them, he explained. The air circulation systems in those cabins were modified to allow for the introduction of gases or aerosols. Even the beds had sensors built into them that could monitor heart rate, breathing, and movement. Lee, the maintenance worker's revelations, confirmed many of the theories I had developed based on my previous interviews. The Oceanic Voyager was indeed a floating laboratory where passengers were unknowingly subjected to monitoring and experimentation. The Harper family had been placed in cabin 7432 because it was one of the most heavily instrumented rooms on the ship. James had quit his job on the Oceanic Voyager after witnessing something that had shaken him to his core. In December of 2017, about 3 months before the Harper family disappeared, I was doing routine maintenance in one of the hidden laboratory areas, he said. I opened a storage room that I thought was empty, and I found medical records and video files for dozens of passengers. The records showed detailed information about psychological experiments, drug trials, and behavioral modification techniques that had been performed on people without their knowledge. Among these records, James had found documentation of previous incidents where passengers had disappeared from the ship under mysterious circumstances. It wasn't just the Harpers, he said. There had been other families, other individuals who had vanished from the ship over the years. The records showed that these people had been selected for specific experiments, and when the experiments were completed or when the subjects became problematic, they were eliminated. Indeed, the documentation James had discovered included detailed psychological profiles of missing passengers, research protocols for various experiments, and video recordings of subjects being monitored in their cabins. Some of the videos showed people sleeping in their beds while researchers in another room watched their vital signs and brain activity, James said. Other videos showed people who appeared to be unconscious being moved through the ship's hidden corridors. James had tried to copy some of these files to expose what was happening on the ship, but he had been discovered by security personnel before he could complete the theft. They didn't arrest me or anything like that, he said, but they made it very clear that if I ever talked about what I had seen, I would have a serious accident. They transferred me to different duties where I wouldn't have access to the restricted areas, and they watched me constantly until I quit. The testimonies from Maria Santos and James Mitchell provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. The Harper family had been victims of a sophisticated human experimentation program that had been operating aboard the Oceanic Voyager for years. They had been selected, monitored, and ultimately eliminated when they became aware of what was happening to them. But I still needed to understand how the research program operated and who was ultimately responsible for it. The connections to Nexus behavioral research suggested that the experiments were being conducted for intelligence or military purposes, but I needed more specific information about the organization and individuals behind the program. My investigation into Nexus behavioral research led me to Dr. Marcus Steinberg, the organization's founder and director. Steinberg was a controversial figure in the psychology and intelligence communities, with a career that spanned over 4 decades of research into mind control, behavioral modification, and psychological warfare. He had been involved in the CIA's MK-Ultra program in the 1960s and 70s, working on projects that attempted to develop techniques for controlling human behavior through drugs, hypnosis, and environmental manipulation. After MK-Ultra was officially shut down in the late 1970s, Steinberg had transitioned to private research, establishing Nexus behavioral research as a way to continue his work outside of government oversight. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Nexus had conducted studies for various government agencies and private clients, focusing on applications of psychological research to intelligence gathering, military training, and corporate management. However, Steinberg's research methods had always been controversial. He believed that traditional ethical guidelines were obstacles to scientific progress and that important psychological insights could only be gained through studies that wouldn't be approved by institutional review boards. This philosophy had led to numerous conflicts with regulatory agencies and had eventually forced Nexus to move its operations offshore. By the 2000s, Nexus had established research facilities in several countries with limited oversight of psychological research. They had developed partnerships with military organizations, intelligence agencies, and private corporations that were interested in the practical applications of behavioral modification techniques. The cruise ship program represented a new phase in their research, the ability to conduct long-term studies on large numbers of subjects in a controlled environment. Dr. Steinberg himself was difficult to locate. He maintained homes in multiple countries and traveled frequently between Nexus's various research facilities. However, I was eventually able to arrange a phone interview with him through a contact at a university where he occasionally lectured on applied psychology. Steinberg was in his 80s, but his voice was still sharp and commanding. He was initially suspicious of my questions about Nexus and the Oceanic Voyager, but he gradually became more open as I demonstrated my knowledge of his research and career. He seemed almost eager to discuss his work, as if he rarely had the opportunity to speak with someone who understood the significance of what he was trying to accomplish. Most people don't understand the importance of behavioral research, Steinberg told me during our 2-hour conversation. They're caught up in ethical considerations that prevent them from seeing the bigger picture. The techniques we've developed at Nexus have applications that could revolutionize psychology, education, therapy, and even international relations. But we can only perfect these techniques through carefully controlled studies on human subjects. When I asked Steinberg specifically about the cruise ship research program, he was initially evasive. However, as our conversation continued, he became more forthcoming about Nexus's partnership with various maritime organizations. Cruise ships provide an ideal environment for longitudinal behavioral studies, he explained. You have subjects from diverse backgrounds confined to a limited space for extended periods. You can control their environment, monitor their behavior, and test various interventions without the subjects being aware that they're participating in research. It's a perfect natural laboratory. Steinberg confirmed that Nexus had been involved in modifying passenger vessels to support psychological research, but he insisted that their work was always conducted within legal boundaries and with appropriate safeguards for subject welfare. We're not interested in harming people, he said. We're interested in understanding how people respond to different environmental and psychological conditions. This understanding can be used to improve therapy, enhance education, and develop more effective methods for resolving conflicts. However, when I pressed Steinberg about specific incidents where passengers had disappeared from ships involved in Nexus research, his tone became more defensive. Sometimes, research subjects experience adverse reactions to experimental conditions, he admitted. In these cases, we have protocols for providing appropriate medical care and ensuring that subjects receive the help they need. But we cannot discuss specific cases due to confidentiality requirements. The interview with Steinberg confirmed my suspicions about the nature of the research being conducted aboard the Oceanic Voyager, but it also raised new questions about the scope and purpose of the program. If Nexus was indeed conducting large-scale psychological experiments on cruise ship passengers, how many ships were involved? How many passengers had been unknowingly subjected to experimental procedures? And what was the ultimate goal of this research? To answer these questions, I began investigating other cruise ships that might have connections to Nexus behavioral research. Through corporate filings and maritime records, I identified several vessels that had undergone similar modifications to the Oceanic Voyager and that were owned by companies with connections to Nexus or its affiliated organizations. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Over the past 2 decades, at least 12 cruise ships had been converted or modified to support covert research programs. These ships operated regular passenger cruises while simultaneously conducting psychological and medical experiments on their guests. The programs were carefully designed to avoid detection, with research activities disguised as routine ship operations and medical emergencies. The selection of research subjects appeared to follow specific criteria. Families like the Harpers were ideal because they were stable, close-knit, and unlikely to be missed immediately if something went wrong. Solo travelers and elderly passengers were also frequently selected because they had fewer social connections and were less likely to generate public attention if they disappeared. The research protocols seemed to focus on understanding how people responded to various forms of psychological pressure and environmental manipulation. Subjects might be exposed to subliminal messaging, given drugs without their knowledge, subjected to temperature and lighting changes, or monitored while they slept. The goal appeared to be developing techniques that could be used to influence behavior, extract information, or control large groups of people. But the most disturbing aspect of the program was what happened to subjects who became aware of the research. According to the documentation James Mitchell had discovered, passengers who figured out that they were being experimented on were typically subjected to more intensive procedures designed to either discredit their perceptions or eliminate them entirely. The Harper family had fallen into this category. Based on the photos found in Sarah's camera, they had somehow discovered that their cabin was equipped with monitoring devices and that they were being watched. Their attempts to explore the ship and gather evidence had been detected by the research staff, leading to their ultimate elimination. 5 years passed after the Harper family's disappearance. The case grew cold, relegated to dusty files and late-night true crime forums. The official investigation was closed, with the family's disappearance classified as a presumed accident at sea. The Oceanic Voyager continued its regular cruise schedule, though the ship's ownership had been transferred to a new company and several crew members had been replaced. Cabin 7432 was eventually taken out of service, officially due to structural issues that made it unsuitable for passenger occupancy. However, according to sources within the cruise line, the real reason was that passengers assigned to that cabin continued to report strange experiences, voices in the walls, mirrors that didn't reflect properly, and feelings of being watched constantly. The Harper family's disappearance had created a liability for the research program. The extensive media coverage and FBI investigation had brought unwanted attention to the ship and its operations. As a result, Nexus had suspended its cruise ship research activities and had relocated its programs to other platforms where they could operate with less scrutiny. David and Sarah's parents held memorial services for their children and grandchildren, though no bodies were ever found. Emma and Jake were declared legally dead, and their college funds were transferred to a missing children's charity. The world seemed ready to forget about the Harper family and move on to other mysteries. But on October 12, 2023, 5 years and 7 months after the disappearance, everything changed. Maria Santos, not the cruise ship employee, but a different woman with the same name, was jogging along Playa del Carmen beach in Mexico when she spotted something unusual half buried in the sand. It was a red Samsonite suitcase, weathered by years of salt water and sun exposure, but still recognizable by its distinctive shape and color. The logo on the side was barely visible, but Maria could make out the letters OCE, part of the Oceanic Cruise Line emblem. She called the local authorities, who contacted the FBI when they realized the potential significance of her discovery. Within hours, the suitcase was on a plane to Washington, D.C., where it would be examined by forensic specialists and federal investigators. I was called in to examine the suitcase's contents as part of the FBI's renewed investigation into the Harper case. When we opened it in the Bureau's forensic laboratory, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Inside were Sarah Harper's clothes, exactly matching the items listed on the ship's missing persons report from 5 years earlier. The clothes were damaged by saltwater and marine organisms, but they were unmistakably the same garments that Sarah had packed for her family's dream vacation. But there was something else in the suitcase that changed everything. A waterproof camera case containing a digital camera that was still functional after all these years in the ocean. When our technical specialists extracted the memory card and examined its contents, what we found revolutionized our understanding of what had happened to the Harper family. The camera contained 127 photos and 3 short video clips spanning the entire duration of the Harper family's cruise. The first images showed typical vacation pictures, the family boarding the ship, posing in their cabin, eating in the dining room, playing in the arcade. These photos matched the timeline of their known activities and confirmed that they had indeed been enjoying their vacation during the first few days. However, the later photos told a very different story. Starting around the 3rd day of the cruise, the images began to show the family in areas of the ship that weren't supposed to be accessible to passengers. Dark corridors, machinery rooms, and what appeared to be hidden sections of the ship that didn't appear on any official deck plans. In these photos, the Harper family looked increasingly concerned and frightened. One particularly disturbing series of photos showed the interior of what appeared to be a research laboratory hidden somewhere within the ship. The images captured sophisticated medical equipment, computer monitors displaying vital signs and brain activity, and walls lined with video screens showing surveillance footage from various passenger cabins. In one photo, you could clearly see cabin 7432 on one of the monitors, with the Harper family's beds visible in the frame. The final photos were the most shocking. They showed David Harper examining what appeared to be a hidden camera behind the mirror in their cabin. Sarah was photographed holding documents that looked like research protocols and passenger profiles. Emma and Jake were shown looking through files that contained personal information about cruise passengers, including medical records and psychological evaluations. But it was the video clips that provided the most damning evidence. The first video, recorded in the family's cabin, showed David carefully removing the mirror from the wall to reveal a sophisticated surveillance setup behind it. His voice, clearly audible on the recording, said, "Sarah, look at this. They've been watching us the whole time. There are cameras, microphones, even sensors that are monitoring our vital signs." The second video clip showed the family exploring a hidden area of the ship that they had accessed through a maintenance corridor. Sarah's voice provided narration as they moved through what appeared to be a research facility. "This is unbelievable," she whispered. "There are dozens of rooms here, all set up for monitoring passengers. Look at all these files. They have detailed information about everyone on the ship." The final video clip was only 18 seconds long, but it contained audio that made my blood run cold. It was recorded in what appeared to be cabin 7432, but the lighting was different, harsh and clinical, rather than the warm cabin lighting. Sarah's voice, shaking with terror, whispered, "They're coming back. If anyone finds this, cabin 7432 isn't what it seems. The mirrors show the truth, but they're watching through them. They've been experimenting on all of us. They took Jake to the medical bay 3 times, but he doesn't remember any of it. They're drugging us, monitoring us, and now they know we know." The video cut off abruptly, with the sound of heavy footsteps and voices approaching. The timestamp showed it was recorded at 3:47 a.m. on the night the family disappeared, more than 4 hours after the ship's security system claimed they had returned to their cabin and gone to sleep. But perhaps the most significant discovery was a small notebook tucked into a waterproof bag along with the camera. The notebook contained Sarah's handwritten observations about their experience on the ship, documenting strange occurrences that had begun on their second night aboard. Her notes described feeling disoriented and confused after meals, experiencing vivid dreams that seemed unusually realistic, and noticing that their reflections in the cabin mirror sometimes seemed to lag behind their actual movements. Sarah had also documented suspicious behavior from crew members, including being visited by medical personnel who claimed to be conducting routine health checks, but who asked unusual questions about their family history, psychological state, and reactions to stress. She noted that Jake had been taken to the medical bay multiple times for what were described as precautionary examinations, but that he had no memory of these visits and showed signs of having been sedated. The notebook revealed that the Harper family had gradually become aware that they were being monitored and experimented upon. Sarah's final entries showed that they had begun planning to gather evidence of the research program and to find a way to alert authorities once they returned to port. Unfortunately, their investigative activities had been detected by the ship's security systems, leading to their elimination before they could expose the truth. The discovery of the suitcase and its contents prompted the FBI to reopen the Harper case and launch a comprehensive investigation into the cruise ship industry's connections to covert research programs. However, the investigation faced significant obstacles from the beginning. Many of the key figures in the original case had died or disappeared in the intervening 5 years. The Oceanic Voyager had been sold and reflagged multiple times, making it difficult to trace its current ownership or location. When investigators attempted to contact Nexus Behavioral Research, they discovered that the organization had officially dissolved in 2020, with its assets transferred to a web of shell companies and offshore trusts. Dr. Marcus Steinberg had died in 2021, taking his knowledge of the research programs with him to the grave. Other key researchers had either died, disappeared, or claimed to have no knowledge of any unethical experiments. The cruise line that had originally operated the Oceanic Voyager was equally uncooperative. Oceanic Cruise Lines had been acquired by a larger corporation in 2019, and the new owners claimed that they had no access to records from the previous management. When pressed for information about the ship's modification history and research partnerships, company representatives cited confidentiality agreements and ongoing litigation as reasons for their inability to provide details. Despite these obstacles, the FBI investigation did uncover evidence that supported the theories I had developed about the Harper case. Financial records showed payments from Nexus Behavioral Research to various maritime companies between 2003 and 2018. Personnel records revealed that several crew members with backgrounds in psychology and medical research had worked on multiple ships in the fleet. Technical specifications obtained through subpoenas confirmed that certain passenger cabins had been equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment. However, the investigation also revealed that the cruise ship research program had been much larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Documents recovered from a Nexus storage facility showed that the organization had been conducting experiments on cruise ship passengers for over 15 years, involving dozens of ships and thousands of unwitting subjects. The research protocols covered a wide range of psychological and medical experiments. Some studies focused on the effects of environmental manipulation on behavior and decision-making. Others tested the efficacy of subliminal messaging and pharmaceutical interventions for controlling mood and cognition. The most disturbing protocols involved experiments designed to test the breaking points of family relationships and individual psychological resilience. The Harper family had been selected for a study called Project Family Dynamics, which was designed to test how family units responded to increasing levels of psychological pressure and surveillance. The research protocol called for subjects to be gradually made aware that they were being monitored, with researchers documenting how this awareness affected family relationships and individual behavior. According to the protocol, subjects who adapted well to the surveillance and showed no signs of resistance would be allowed to complete their cruise and return home, with their memories of the unusual experiences dismissed as vacation stress or imagination. However, subjects who became actively resistant or who attempted to gather evidence of the research would be subjected to more intensive interventions. The Harper family had fallen into the second category. Their attempts to explore the ship and document the research program had triggered security protocols that classified them as compromised subjects. The protocol for dealing with compromised subjects was chillingly clinical. They were to be detained, subjected to intensive psychological evaluation, and then permanently removed from the study through methods that would not attract attention from law enforcement or media. The notebook and camera evidence showed that the Harper family had discovered far more about the research program than their handlers had realized. Sarah's notes revealed a sophisticated understanding of the surveillance techniques being used against them, and a detailed plan for gathering evidence that could be used to expose the entire operation. If they had been allowed to return home, their testimony and evidence could have shut down the cruise ship research program years earlier. The investigation also revealed that the Harper family's fate had been sealed not just by their discovery of the research program, but by their specific psychological profiles. According to Nexus documents, David's background in computer security made him particularly dangerous because he had the technical skills to understand and document the surveillance systems. Sarah's work as a guidance counselor gave her insights into psychological manipulation techniques that made her a threat to the research staff. Even Emma and Jake were considered risks because their academic achievement and intelligence made them likely to remember and report their experiences. But what happened to the Harper family after they were taken from their cabin remained a mystery. The video evidence and witness testimonies suggested that they had been removed from the ship alive, but there was no indication of where they had been taken or what had ultimately happened to them. The discovery of Sarah's suitcase in Mexican waters suggested that they had been killed and their bodies disposed of at sea, but no physical remains were ever found. Dr. Amanda Sterling, the former Nexus researcher who had been one of my key sources, provided some theories about the family's fate during a follow-up interview. Nexus had protocols for dealing with compromised subjects that went beyond simple elimination, she explained. In some cases, subjects would be transferred to offshore research facilities where they could be subjected to more intensive psychological modification techniques. The goal was to either completely erase their memories of the research program or to make them so psychologically unstable that their testimony would be dismissed as delusional. According to Dr. Sterling, Nexus maintained several research facilities on remote islands in the Caribbean and Pacific, where they could conduct experiments that would be illegal in any civilized country. These facilities were designed to hold subjects for extended periods, while researchers attempted to modify their memories, personality, and behavior through a combination of pharmaceutical, psychological, and technological interventions. The Harper family's intelligence and strong family bonds would have made them ideal subjects for these advanced modification techniques, Dr. Sterling said. Nexus was always interested in understanding how to break down family relationships and individual identity. A close-knit family like the Harpers would have provided valuable data about the limits of psychological manipulation. The possibility that the Harper family might still be alive, held in some remote research facility, was both hopeful and horrifying. If they had survived the initial phase of their ordeal, they might have spent the past 5 years as subjects in psychological experiments that could have fundamentally altered their personalities and memories. They might not even remember who they were or recognize each other if they were ever found. However, the discovery of Sarah's suitcase in Mexican waters suggested a different and more final outcome. The timing of the discovery, 5 years after their disappearance, suggested that the suitcase had been deliberately released into the ocean, possibly as part of a plan to provide closure to the case, while maintaining plausible deniability about what had actually happened to the family. The condition of the suitcase and its contents also raised questions about the circumstances of its disposal. While the exterior showed signs of long-term exposure to saltwater, the interior items were remarkably well preserved. suggesting that the suitcase had been sealed and stored in controlled conditions before being placed in the ocean. The camera and notebook had been carefully protected with multiple layers of waterproof packaging, as if someone had wanted to ensure that they would survive long enough to be discovered. This led me to consider the possibility that someone with knowledge of the Harper family's fate had deliberately arranged for the evidence to be found. Perhaps a researcher or security operative involved in their elimination had developed a conscience and decided to provide some form of justice for the family, or perhaps the release of the evidence was part of a larger power struggle within the organizations responsible for the research program. The timing of the discovery also seemed significant. The suitcase had surfaced just as several key figures in the research program were dying or disappearing, and at a time when changes in government administration and intelligence oversight were making it more difficult to maintain covert research operations. It was possible that someone had decided that the risks of keeping the Harper evidence secret had become greater than the risks of allowing it to be discovered. Regardless of the motivations behind its release, the discovery of Sarah's suitcase had provided crucial evidence that confirmed many of the theories about the Harper family's disappearance. The photos, videos, and notebook entries provided irrefutable proof that they had been victims of an illegal human experimentation program, and that their disappearance had been a deliberate act of murder rather than an accident or random crime. The evidence also provided insights into the scope and sophistication of the cruise ship research program. The images of hidden laboratories and surveillance facilities showed that the Oceanic Voyager had been converted into a floating research platform capable of conducting complex psychological and medical experiments on large numbers of subjects simultaneously. The documentation of passenger profiles and research protocols revealed a systematic approach to selecting and manipulating test subjects that had been refined over many years of operation. But perhaps most importantly, the Harper family's evidence provided a voice for the thousands of other passengers who had been unknowingly subjected to these experiments over the years. Their courage in investigating and documenting what was happening to them, even in the face of mortal danger, had created a record that could finally bring justice for all the victims of the cruise ship research program. The FBI investigation that followed the discovery of the suitcase led to criminal charges against several individuals connected to the research program, though many of the key figures were already dead or beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Congressional hearings were held to examine the oversight failures that had allowed the program to operate for so many years without detection. New regulations were implemented to prevent cruise ships from being used as platforms for covert research. However, many questions about the Harper family's fate remained unanswered. Despite extensive searches of potential research facilities and detention sites, no trace of the family members was ever found. The investigation into their disappearance officially remained open, but the likelihood of finding them alive diminished with each passing year. The case had a profound impact on the cruise industry, leading to increased oversight of ship modifications and crew background checks. Public confidence in cruise safety was severely damaged, and several cruise lines faced significant financial losses as passengers chose alternative vacation options. The industry was forced to implement new transparency measures and to allow independent inspections of their vessels to restore public trust. For me personally, the Harper case became a defining moment in my career as an investigator. The complexity of the conspiracy, the sophistication of the cover-up, and the human cost of the research program made it unlike anything I had ever encountered. The case taught me that even in our modern world, with its extensive surveillance and communication networks, it was still possible for powerful organizations to commit horrific crimes against innocent people. The Harper family's story also served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and skepticism in our daily lives. David, Sarah, Emma, and Jake had been ordinary people who had trusted that their vacation cruise would be safe and enjoyable. They had no reason to suspect that they were walking into a nightmare of surveillance and experimentation. Their tragedy showed that we must always be alert to the possibility that things are not what they seem, and that we must be prepared to question authority when our instincts tell us that something is wrong. But perhaps most importantly, the Harper family's courage in the face of unimaginable terror provided an example of how ordinary people can fight back against extraordinary evil. Even when they realized that they were trapped and that their lives were in danger, they continued to gather evidence and document their experiences. Their determination to expose the truth, even at the cost of their own lives, ultimately led to the downfall of the research program and justice for its many victims. The red suitcase now sits in an evidence locker at FBI headquarters, a tangible reminder of the Harper family's sacrifice and the price of unchecked power. But their true legacy lives on in the reforms that followed their disappearance, the prosecutions that brought their killers to justice, and the awareness that their story has created about the potential for abuse in seemingly innocent settings. What haunts me most about this case is not just what happened to the Harper family, but what their story reveals about the world we live in. Behind the facade of luxury cruises and family vacations, there existed a shadow world of surveillance, experimentation, and exploitation that operated with impunity for decades. The Harper family stumbled into this world by accident, but thousands of other passengers were deliberately drawn into it without ever knowing what was happening to them. Their story is not just a mystery to be solved, but a warning about the dangers that exist just beneath the surface of our seemingly safe and civilized society. It reminds us that we must always be vigilant, always questioning, and always ready to fight for the truth, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against us. Every time I see a cruise ship advertisement or pass by a travel agency's window display, I think about the Harper family. I think about David reading his crossword puzzle, Sarah charging her phone, Emma doing her makeup, and Jake playing his Nintendo DS. I think about how normal and happy they looked in those final security camera images, completely unaware that they were about to become victims of one of the most sophisticated and evil conspiracies of our time. The truth about what happened to David, Sarah, Emma, and Jake Harper may never be fully revealed. But their story has already accomplished something important. It has opened our eyes to the possibility that the world is not always what it seems, and that we must never stop fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes or how powerful our enemies might be. What do you think really happened to the Harper family? Do you believe they discovered something on that cruise ship that cost them their lives? Leave your theory in the comments below and let me know if you think there are other cases like this that deserve investigation.